especially, again, in the world that humans help create. And, you know, had there not been humans, that never would have spread outside their natural reservoir, more or less, you know, it just stayed there for eons. Okay, I think we've hammered that kind of to death, so I think there was supposed to be someone to talk, a few comments made on the
Chapter 2.
significance and the Muslim, Jewish prosecution. Is that correct? Am I remembering this?
No, we're starting today on chapter 2.
Yeah,
So that's
smallpox, but somebody
Okay.
had, didn't we talk about?
I thought we finished.
Well,
Did we? Or no?
maybe we did,
We were gonna talk about religion, I think.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
Did you want to say just a couple things yet about that at all?
I
or-
think Amanda was gonna say something.
Okay.
But all I really had about religion was the whole witching thing, how they were trying to purify themselves. It's crazy ceremony. They're horrible. And then, I don't know, they basically thought that it was just the wrath of God coming down on them because of things that they had done wrong.
Okay.
Mhm.
And the priest stayed away and basically said that you guys didn't do what you're supposed to, so we're not gonna bless you when you die, when they were really just scared and didn't want to get sick.
What were some of the effects? I mean, you've all read, and, you know, I want you to start thinking in that way. Of other people too, and we've all read. What were some of the big effects? We barely mentioned those, and we should at least get under our belts a couple of the major effects. What, after it was over? And there's a series of those over the years. What were some?
I mean, it was like a rebirth to some degree. I mean, and there were
Oh, there you
changes
go.
in art and literature, and it reflected in those areas.
Why might that have been, what she's saying? It's kind of laid the groundwork, and she's right, for the Renaissance, kind of developed later on, but why might that, what specifically might have led to that? Well, I'm being rhetoric in a way, because certain things I have in mind, but I'm just asking you, well, one of the things that broke down for an awful lot of society, church authority. So you started getting dissections and anatomy, all that was forbidden before, human anatomy. So Da Vinci came along that, you know, in that period of time, started doing human anatomy, people started opening folks and doing cadaver studies, and all of that opened up. And then people, remember too, what is it? There's another real big thing that it really accomplished. This broke down. So this is sometimes called the silver lining of this tremendous killing off, up to 50%. And I've read that somewhere down in France and Italy where it raged for 4 years straight, unlike maybe England, so maybe 75% of the population. Really died off. Can you imagine the panic? What about we knew today? Or it says, I grew up with this with the Soviet Union. We were a red button away from being mutually destroyed. I grew up in the Dakotas on a ranch and farm about 40 miles from 2 or 3 huge, you know, sack bases there and Alemania and deep silos, all aimed at Russia and keyed in. You know, it can make big panic. And some of the people just, like today, would do and say, heck, I might as well live for the minute. And they went out drinking, debauchery, and, you know, the whole thing, didn't it? Said, you know, that whether they've been able to trace it from the original sources writing during that time. But something else happened as part of a silver lining with this. The number of people plummeted so that labor could start bargaining for better deal for themselves, huh? That's a major thing because it broke down feudalism. It broke down the manorial system. And where in some countries they tried to fight that, they lost. And so now they could rent their land out, but they became sharecroppers, and they were no longer tied as serfs to the land. That's a huge thing in human historical evolution. We have that change. And then mechanization, there was incentive for that, and that tied up with exploration with smallpox into different parts of the world. And because exploration was made possible, and it was driven by capital accumulation and technology advance and sailing vessels and everything, a whole series of things. So it kicked off what, in short, is sometimes summed up in Earth 0 saying, the Renaissance. the basis for the Renaissance. And certainly art styles and forms and that sort of stuff.
Playing around with medicine too.
Yes.
Herbs and things like that.
People started looking at cleaning up, starting to understand, other than blaming it on Jewish or other minorities and wiping them out. I was in the army in Mainz, Germany, and it happened to be one of the places that the Jews wiped off the map, and almost in that city in Germany, in Stuttgart, and some of those. Germany was scary when you think about what happened in 1938 on, but it's almost like a shift or a dry run on making use of that, but people blame them for, and minorities often get blamed for situations like that where they're not among the power brokers and particularly among the dominant people they call the shots. That's an easy out anyway. And they were blamed specifically for what? Poisoning wells and water and all that sort of stuff. But, and then I thought an interesting, which I know nothing of, but Muslims really did differ. This was to them something that God sent down, and to whether it survive or not meant that you got a better, the kind of a jihad of sort, you were guaranteed almost getting to paradise by suffering through this, surviving or not. And if you didn't survive, well, then you got. It didn't have the same concept as Christianity as sin and as a commission of sin, because that would imply, as I think your book talks about, an outside force delivering this with delivered by God. So those, I think, are interesting kind of stuff that actually you could trace into some modern kinds of variations among different religions and how things are viewed, disasters of various sorts that you have no control over. So people did also start cleaning up garbage. I started seeing some of that, and there were some health things coming out of this too, including isolation of populations. Because people, in some of those source readings, people started seeing that people that are isolated in rural areas didn't have near, it turns out, contagion as those that lived in these dense, probably poor, shabby housing, and these dense populations were, especially pulmonary version of this, would have been just perfect for spreading it quickly and a deadly source of it. Enough said. Let's go on then to the second chapter and the second major disease. And incidentally, I didn't define this, but mortality, you know what that is. Your book is actually confusing and is not correct on the very introductory where you talk about morbidity. Morbidity is actually just the percentage or the rate of sickness of a particular disease in a particular time period. That's morbidity. Mortality is death rate as a rate expressed in epidemiology. And they talk about it, he talks about it as something
Yeah, it was
different.
kind of a little bit confusing.
So it's a little, if you're reading it close, it could be confusing. The other thing in this chapter, and then I will shut my mouth, the opening page, he talks about the New World as the Spanish get into it, folks, their exploration and colonialization, was not disease-free. Totally true. And some of that we'll look at later on in the PowerPoints. But they mentioned venereal syphilis. And the best evidence there is no good evidence at all of venereal syphilis before Cortez comes in. There is evidence of several strains of treponemes. These are corkscrew spirochete bacteria that causes syphilis, but there are several strains, one of which is Yaws. We'll talk about that more in the PowerPoint, so I wouldn't worry about that now. And it can manifest itself in bone to mimic or look like venereal syphilis, but there is no good evidence for venereal syphilis. There is for that group, that genus of diseases. So a lot more about that later, but to use venereal in front of this and not use just the treponemes or Yaws, one of those other forms, is incorrect, basically. Big deal. So, but I did want to mention that. So now, we're going to go on. I think you started it, huh?
Yes.
Our
Okay.
parade here, and then hopefully everyone's read it, and then you can introduce something for a little while, and hopefully we can center and talk about it.
Well, I'm starting on, this is on chapter 2. I have the pages from
Mhm.
47 to 53, and
Okay. Thank
this
you.
is chapters, the American Holocaust, the smallpox in Americas from 1518 to 1670. Actually, reading this chapter was really interesting for me because I was born in South America, so we were kind of exposed to this when we did history. Yeah, in our country, this gets talked a lot about in our history books. So anyway, and actually to this day, I've read quite a few other books. I took an epidemiology class, and we had to do some research on this. And there's probably hundreds of people getting their masters or their doctorates writing on the colonialism
For sure.
and the impact of diseases, not only in South America, but Asia and Africa. And it's really a touchy subject. You see it here manifested in Pueblo because when you have the Columbus Day Parade, you have people who are Italian extraction who proudly will parade, and then you have people protesting. So it's a touchy subject.
Exactly.
Yeah, and if you look at the numbers as you read the chapter, the numbers are just staggering. It's
Even on the low end.
Right,
Even on the low end,
Exactly.
exactly what I was gonna say. I have been associated with
Because that's what I noticed.
Metro America for 30 years, and I've seen all those kind of spectrums,
Yeah.
But taking like towards the low end, which is where I come out, it's still pretty
yeah,
Pretty
incredible,
Yeah.
because it's virgin soil.
yeah. So one of the you already touched on the fact that even before the Europeans arrived here, predominantly the Spanish and the Portuguese, before they arrived, I mean, the Indians were not disease free. Obviously, they already had some ailments, but and then I found one sentence here in the book was it talked about the European presence in the native population, and this is kind of underscored my intro, is that the attack on the native population was like a hurricane, but the way I put it in my phrasing was that it was like a meteor shower, because if you look at the time frame from 1518 to 1670, that's a century and a half. I mean, you know, talk about having like a really bad century and a half of maladies occurred to you, and so it's pretty devastating. And the whole epidemic was really the worst on the native population. So the impact in the opening section really can't be talked about enough. In terms of the smallpox, has an interesting history, not only in the book, but some previous research that I've done. It's one of the oldest diseases known to humans. There's a probable presence of it in Mesopotamia, which is where modern-day Iraq is, and then Egypt. India has some evidence of it, and actually when I did some research on Wikipedia, I found a link that had some really good information about India and some texts that actually scientists are studying to think that it was actually smallpox. So they're kind of removing it away from the probable to the probably there already. Of course, the Greeks and the ancient Romans, the Chinese and the Japanese in respective different centuries had exposure to it, and it was first identified by an Arab physician in the 9th century. Having read a lot about the Iberian Peninsula, it's really amazing to think that at that time period in the 9th century, the 800s, really the Arab world was far more advanced in medicine and in scholarship. I mean, the libraries that they kept and the experimentation that they did during their golden era. If you talk to somebody from the Iberian Peninsula that's not of Arabic, they'll use a different phrase. But the point is that the Arabs at that time, along with the Jews, really they were very advanced.
Tremendous libraries in
Yeah.
Constantinople, for example, in Turkey. Residues of some of those are still there.
Yeah.
And then it all fell out. It's an interesting
Yeah.
question
It is.
itself of where Muslim scholarship dropped
It
off.
just dropped off. Yeah.
And then the whole era went towards Western side. But anyway, that's another question. Good,
Yeah.
good point.
And then it's smallpox. Smallpox is caused by a virus, and it has two different forms of variola major, which is the one that has killed at the greater rate throughout history, like 25 to 30% of the population. And then the minor one, it's 1% death rate. but nevertheless a significant amount. And the issue with smallpox is that it's so deadly because it's communicable so easily. So that's what makes it probably more effective from the standpoint of the disease, you know.
Mario, excellent. But Mario introduces a point here where, again, if I haven't, I should make it a little clearer to most of you that there are two epidemiologies, two other terms that we have thrown one around, well, two or three around. But pandemic is really widespread.
Yeah.
Epidemic, that goes really wide, like the Great Plague, like smallpox. And then there is epidemic, which is somewhat more localized, but still fairly widespread. And then there is endemic, which means usually the rate of these things, and often the virulence, is very low, and everybody kind of gets it as a childhood disease, very few die, but it's always endemic in different, like TB was for many, many years. After we thought we got rid of it, it was endemic in many poor countries and situations where it would really be able to take off under different kind of conditions. So just those terms. Go ahead, Mark.
Okay, and then now I'm up to the third section on page 49, the defenses against smallpox. Strangely enough, we don't have a cure for smallpox. It's just been contained. And then this gentleman, Dr. Edward Jenner, was the first one to really develop a vaccination. And the word vaccination comes from the Latin word vaca, which means cow. And then as a technique, the vaccinations, they can also work against other in viral infections, like it mentions in the book, influenza, and there's a whole slew of them. And the upside of all of this, this wrath of the smallpox, is that actually by 1979, it was officially declared by international organizations. I guess it was a Global Commission for the Eradication of Smallpox. It was declared eradicated by 1979. And I thought it was kind of interesting here, the last paragraph of page 50, about that there's still some last remaining stocks of viruses. They were scheduled to be executed or terminated in 1999. So it's kind of interesting because, you know, you kind of start thinking about bioterrorism, you know, kind of like a James Bond
The funny
type
thing,
movie or
the
something
visual
like
that I
that.
got when I read that was like the Americans hold them there,
Yeah.
and the Russians hold them
Yeah,
there, and
yeah,
they're going, you
the
first,
Cold War isn't
you
over.
first.
Or we've
You get-
destroyed ours and knock knock.
Not all of it.
Nobody's gonna get rid of it because they don't believe that the
That's
other
right,
person's
so
gonna get rid of
they
it.
generate it
Yeah.
quickly. I mean, it's a they're
But
away from that
They're not so confident,
geopolitics.
Yeah.
they're not so confident that it's eradicated completely because servicemen are still
Yeah.
vaccinated against smallpox.
Right.
Still to this day,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, and
Did you?
there was some big
Yeah, it
discussion
does.
about that, wasn't there, a few years ago? Whether among the services, there was a real disagreement whether the Marines were gonna do it and the Army not, and the Army, I think, led
Well,
for
the thing
ratings.
about it is now, is it is a required vaccination. However, there are some ways you can keep from getting it. Like me, I have issues with dry skin.
Uh-huh.
So if you have dry skin, you can't get it because you'll immediately contract it and you're done. Because
Okay,
you can't be cured from it.
okay, great.
Did you ever get the
What
vaccination?
an insight.
They're very
So did
particular
I.
about even handling the site.
Not
where
fun.
it's-
I got the anthrax
And
vax.
as a nurse, yeah, I agree.
You know, they give you the smallpox one?
I've worked extensively in the plasma industry,
I'm allergic
and
to
sometimes
Oh,
with
yeah.
the smallpox vaccine, there's a great waiting period after they've had it, because they make immune globulins with the plasma, and you
Well,
don't
there was a,
inadvertently.
There's a real remote-
Young.
I don't know.
Are
if
you
it was
sure with smallpox?
What?
They rarely
Smallpox, everything.
they rarely
Did they use
vaccinate
a 3-point fork and just stab them?
What'd she say?
smallpox for children. You're pretty young to be,
No.
I don't
Where?
think so.
Not in this
I think
country.
you're confused.
No,
They don't give kids
Yeah.
smallpox.
no, there's no vaccine.
The only
control
people
of
who
it.
get it is servicemen now.
Is that
And that is real variable now, I think.
No, they
as-
may
as a
give you
service
It's
policy.
still variable for
chickenpox,
some guys.
but not smallpox.
But if, say you're
Chickenpox.
over in either Afghanistan or in Iraq,
Yeah.
if you somehow come across it and you get infected, then they'll give it to you. You have no choice in the matter.
Mhm.
unlike in the States.
And a lot of
if
that
it's an
was-
issue that you can't get it, they
And-
won't do it.
And that, a lot of that was premised originally on Saddam Hussein supply and all
Of
that
chemical
kind of stuff.
weapons.
We
Yeah.
actually found quite a bit of his supplies of it. We'd dig them up right there in the ground, like, oh,
Mm.
and then we'd have to call somebody else in to come and get rid of
The
it.
bio folks and
This is a question directed at you, actually.
Um,
Why do they give it the smallpox vaccination, like, in the location they give it at? Does it matter?
I don't know. I
Because
don't know.
that's not fun.
It's apparently not a fun vaccine, so.
No.
Anything else on these first, before we go to Sierra on the second part?
Actually,
Yeah,
Jeff,
yeah.
one quick,
You go
one,
ahead.
because I have a quick,
Ours
I
overlap
haven't
a little
finished
bit.
the, yeah, the arrival of the,
Page 50.
because the arrival of the smallpox, I won't, you guys read this section, but anybody who's a student of history, and especially if you're a student of North American history, I mean, this little 2 pages really is a good backdrop to understanding American history a little bit better, because the way we're taught of American history is like, you know, our ancestors came from Europe, they kind of, they had a Thanksgiving, and then there's a, you know, they shared
And
the
then the
land.
Indians
Da, da,
moved
da.
out their
Well,
land,
yeah,
And they
exactly.
were happy to do it.
But I thought that one of the really interesting passages was here that it, you know, for example, the disease arrived in 1518 in the New World, in the island of Hispaniola. But then when it started arriving in Mexico, it started to move up the Mississippi, started in the lower Mississippi, moved
Trade
all the
routes.
way, yeah, the trade routes.
Mhm.
So by the time the Indians got pushed back a little further, their backs were being pushed to this disease, so it made it even worse. So then it made it a lot easier for, of course, the Europeans to move into these lands. But you start looking at this, just at the statistics that it quotes here, it's just devastating. For example, I marked here in my book, smallpox continued to afflict Mexico, Central America, and the Andes during 1530s, 1550s, 1570s, 1580s, and then the other important point that I think any student of history should know is that the impact of this disease impacted the 2 great societies, the Aztecs and the Incas, and so it made it a lot easier for the Spanish and later the other Europeans to move in, because it was really the disease that traveled so quickly and killed these people off that it was so easy for Cortez and then of course De Soto on the south side, on the South America, to take over. So you know, you can't read this chapter and not kind of rethink history. You know, you won't read a history book the same way again.
Well,
And if you think back to the very first day, I talked about the different influences and the roles, and
Mhm.
transportation, exploration, and colonialization
Mhm.
were all bundled together.
Mhm.
And disease often gets ahead of all of those
Right.
kind of things
To go along the pathway.
to kind of
Yeah.
seed the pathway.
Mhm.
We'll let you pick.
Like you said, actually, I went to a Christian school, 7th through 12th grade, and so history that I got was so whitewashed. And then when I took history in college, I was like, oh, God, they're horrible people.
Yeah.
And then I actually did take a history class last semester. Brad Bowers taught it, and he's the one who told me about this class. And he taught it in a way that really put the focus on how devastating the arrival of these people in the New World was to the natives here, especially the Aztecs. And he did shed a lot, and I appreciated that it wasn't, you know, the truth was there rather than, but so I did have some ideas about this before I wrote this, but the small and when I took the history class last semester, and the way that he taught it, you know, he talked about the Black Legend and the Spaniards and how, you know, it was a multifactorial assault on these people. It wasn't just smallpox, you know, it was slavery, it was the war, it was all the factors that came together to basically just wipe them out. In the book, it stated that smallpox was one of their weapons, one of the greatest weapons that the Spanish had, whether it was intentional or unintentional. It absolutely did help them, and if it didn't wipe out the people that they were trying to annihilate, basically, because I think that initially that was their purpose, was to wipe the people out. I think later, the Spaniards and the Spanish and the French, viewed them as a resource because they could trade with them and things like that, and the British had less concern about saving the native population, they just wanted them out of the way, so.
So, let me just interrupt, anyone can, with apologies to the lead discussant, but this is a significant point about the nature of colonialism and control and expansion over other people. Of course you have to, all of you have heard of Manifest Destiny, your way of life is the best, and on and on, and you have all the rights to perpetuate that, and in the early days, and God was on your side, and there were various manifestations to establish that point and make it true, in your opinion. So this, the formula itself didn't just come out of thin air, this is